Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Merrifield. I'm a senior vice president with Shaw's Power Group here in Charlotte, and I'm the one at the head table that LJ didn't introduce. So I get to do that one. I do want to thank the World Affairs Council, LJ, and the team for putting together what is really an exceptional event. We are blessed here in Charlotte to have an organization that brings just some outstanding speakers here for us to share and learn. And I think today is certainly, and indeed not an exception, I think an excellent example of that. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker, Jack Gerard, who is the president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, and someone who I have known since we both worked in the U.S. Senate, and I would say a long time ago, I guess is the best way of putting it. I also had, and I'm going to put in a plug, and a bit of a shout out to CPCC's Tony Zeiss. Jack and I just got done with a taping over at TVI, the Chris Williams Show, Carolina Business Journal, which will be televised on Channel 42 on Friday. That is a institution owned by Carolina Piedmont Community College. They do a great job. That's a great program that Chris Williams has, and I think this Friday's program will be particularly good. I think all of you at this point have probably read Jack's bio. Not only has he spent a long time working on the Hill, both for Representative George Hansen and Senator James McClure, but his subsequent career helping to found a lobbying organization as well as serving as the president and CEO of two other prestigious associations, the American Chemistry Council, which is the U.S. chemical industry, and the National Mining Association. From experience, I can tell you that Jack has a track record of service in Washington that is unparalleled. To head not just one, but three of the most significant industry associations in Washington is a major achievement and is indicative of his capabilities, his experience, and the trust he has earned from the folks up in Congress. Now, beyond that biographical information, I'd like to say a few other things about Jack. Well, we all know about the tumult that is currently going on in Congress. It is important to note that Jack worked for what would be one of my favorite senators, the late James McClure, who, although he was a strong Republican, was also a very kind man and a person who knew how to reach out and work across the aisle. I suspect this experience strongly influenced Jack's outlook on life. Indeed, if you look at Jack's achievements over the last 10 years, he has shown a tremendous capability to bring together a wide variety of sometimes quite divergent organizations toward a common goal. For those of us who are in the energy arena, we recognize that success in this field is vital in getting through this economic recovery, and I'm sure we will all have much to learn from Jack's views in this regard. Finally, no introduction of Jack will be complete without mentioning his wife Claudette and their 8 children, 2 of whom are adopted. While many in Washington put their careers first, I think Jack has been a real model in making sure that his family and their interests are central in all that he does in his life. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jack to the dais.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me to be with you today. Jeff read that just like I wrote it, so I really appreciate that, Jeff. It is a pleasure to be with you today. It's great to come to what I call the real people. I live and work in that 5 square miles of Washington, D.C., surrounded by reality, and so it's always great to come out and see what's going on in reality. So it's great to come here to North Carolina today, particularly here in Charlotte, and to spend a few moments with you. Jeff was very gracious in his introduction. I sincerely appreciate that. As he mentioned, my real passions in life, family, my extended family of 8 children, 2 of which are young adopted boys from Guatemala. As Ruth and I were talking earlier, we realized we have a similar passion in that area. And to me, at the end of the day, it's all about the real people, our quality of life, and what it means for us as a nation and as a people. And there's nothing that's more telling, or at least in my mind, more compelling to talk about in that context than the issue of energy. And more specifically, the area that I represent, oil and natural gas industry. Sorry about that. The API, for those who don't know, is the large trade association that represents all aspects of the oil and gas business. We today represent about 517 companies that cover everywhere from the finding aspects of what we call the E&P business, the exploration and production, all the way down to your gas pump. So as one congressman said on occasion as I invited him to my executive committee, he sat there speechless for a few minutes and then finally said, "I didn't think I'd ever be in a room like this before." And what he meant to say is, my executive committee consists of the chairman of ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips, and the list goes on. The reason I say that is not only are they some of the largest companies in the world, but they are very significant contributors to our domestic activity and our economy and our way of life. So as we look to the next week or two here, as the Democratic National Convention comes to your great city, I'm sure you're all excited by that. In our mind, there's nothing more important or more significant to talk about in that context than what energy means in our domestic economy today and what it means for our future as a country, and more specifically, what it means to those of you who live here in North Carolina. Now, here in North Carolina, you are blessed with vast resources of energy, both onshore and offshore. And I know it's a continuing debate in the state legislature, issues you're looking closely at, such as the technology of hydraulic fracturing, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. But with the right policies in place, North Carolina has a unique opportunity to create its own energy legacy as we look to the future, both through production, but equally important in an issue that Jeff mentioned this morning on the television program, through our manufacturing base. Many don't realize that 96% of everything manufactured in the United States is touched by the business of chemistry. Chemistry being the chemical processes that allow us to take the molecular structure of natural gas and convert it to everything we consume on a daily basis. If you look at the fibers in the carpet, the fibers in your clothes, the plastics that go to make autos more efficient, to consume less energy, the treatment on your windows to make them more energy efficient, right down to the composites in the windmill, the panels and solar panels to produce energy, most of which are all derived from petroleum, and in the United States, by and large, natural gas. So when we look at North Carolina's future, we can say to ourselves, look at the great energy production that could occur here, specifically natural gas, but we shouldn't forget the multiplier effects. We hear about the manufacturing renaissance that's taking place in the upper Midwest. If you ask the leaders of those large companies that are bringing those jobs back to the United States, primarily from Asia and elsewhere, they'll tell you the number one factor that's doing that is affordable, reliable energy, specifically clean-burning natural gas. So developing our resources here in North Carolina, particularly our energy, our shale resources, as well as offshore, could lead to the creation of more than 45,000 new jobs by 2020 and add $200 million in new revenue for your state each year through 2030. This is in addition to the 135,000 jobs that you already have in the state and the $6.1 billion in labor income and the $11 billion added to the state's economy every year as a result of the oil and natural gas industry. Now, many people don't realize we normally don't think of North Carolina as an oil and gas state, but you already have a very significant economic footprint that's here as a result of our activities. Energy development will create more jobs, raise our standard of living, enhance our energy security, but allowing us to do so will require increased understanding of the potential benefits, much like I've just spoken about, and an effective partnership between industry and government. We as an industry must foster a straightforward conversation and discussion about what energy means for us as a nation. We need to follow the lead of states like Pennsylvania. Many of you may not be aware, we've created 86,000 new jobs in Pennsylvania in the last 18 months. We need to follow the model of North Dakota Many of you are probably not aware today North Dakota is the #2 oil producer in the United States, behind only Texas. Just this year they passed California and Alaska to the #2 position. Unemployment in North Dakota today, 2.9%. I would challenge any of you to go to North Dakota and find those 2.9%. They're small communities of 12,000 people who today have 20,000 people in them. The median wage in the oil and gas business in North Dakota, $90,000 a person. The median wage for everybody else in North Dakota, $45,000 a person. So when we talk about the future of oil and gas in the United States, it is a terrific opportunity to produce our own energy, generate revenue, but to create jobs at a time we need them most. And these are well-paying jobs. One of our greatest challenges in North Dakota today is to convince those young juniors and seniors in high school to stay in school and to get an education. Many of them can leave and go out and sign up for a $100,000 a year job driving a truck. So as we look at this new game-changing paradigm opportunity, we need to stay focused on what it means for us as a nation. North Dakota is leading the way. Pennsylvania is leading the way. Ohio, the wave is coming right across the country, and it's all due to modern technologies developed by the oil and natural gas industry, where we're able to produce smaller quantities of oil and natural gas that we've always known were there, but didn't know how to do it economically. We've figured that out now, and it will literally reshape the energy paradigm for many years to come. As a world-renowned economist said just 3 months ago, if the public policy of the United States is handled right and well, the United States will become the new Middle East in the next decade. Now think about that for a minute. Think about what we contemplate as we look at volatility in the Middle East, the anxiety and concerns that come from those parts of the world that we have little control and in some instances little influence over. We could produce that resource right here, employ our own people, generate revenue for our state and local governments, and make us energy secure. For those who follow presidential politics, and I'm sure that's all of you here in this room, Governor Mitt Romney at 1 o'clock Western Mountain Time today will announce his vision for the future to make us energy independent by 2020. All this is based on data from bankers, economists, and others who say if we get the public policy right, we can indeed do that right here on our own nation, on our own shores. So as an industry, we've got to foster this straightforward conversation. And let me congratulate those of you who serve the public in public service, Ruth and others, county commissioners, and those who day to day are engaged in this dialogue. We want to be completely transparent to assist you in understanding a fact-based conversation about what this means. Now, one quick fact before I go back to my prepared text. Hydraulic fracturing. This number is going to surprise and shock most of you. The technology of hydraulic fracturing has been used in the oil and gas business for 65 years. We have drilled over 1.2 million wells using hydraulic fracturing, and there has never been a case of groundwater contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. So when you hear the scare stories, when you hear the great concerns, we need to be concerned. We need to address those concerns as an industry. But I would ask you to anchor all your decision-making process in the facts. We have a great record as an industry in protecting the environment, protecting our workforces. We live in these same communities where you live. There is no one more highly motivated to protect the water we drink and the air we breathe than those of us who live in those same communities. So we want to partner with you. We realize that responsibility is ours as an industry to educate the public generally, but don't let some of the shrill critics of industry who fundamentally oppose the development of fossil fuels in this country to create scare and anxiety in the lives of our citizens that would deter us away from good, sound public policies that makes complete economic sense. So we're anxious to anchor it in the facts and have a good public discourse, which we believe creates the best public policy. This might also surprise you. 75% of all North Carolina voters today, in a survey we concluded just last weekend, support expanded development of oil and natural gas, including offshore development off the coast of the Carolinas. We are literally in a game-changing opportunity in this country that if we get it right, it will reshape the world as we know it, including the geopolitical world in the Middle East and elsewhere, if we get it right. But it's going to require the political will to do it and to do it well. Now, in July, the members of your North Carolina State Legislature, Ruth and others, did the right thing. They developed a framework to move forward to develop a regulatory regime, a robust regulatory regime to regulate the oil and natural gas industry. We welcome that regulation. We welcome high standards. The American Petroleum Institute was originally established as a standard-setting organization. On an ongoing basis, certified by third parties, where we bring in transparent experts from regulators to environmental groups to industry experts, we look for and seek the best standards to develop this resource. We then put those out there and encourage legislators, regulatory bodies, and others to adopt them as best practices. We update those at least every 4 to 5 years as a matter of our third-party certification receipt. So we welcome North Carolina looking at this question closely, but we also encourage you to work closely with us because of the great benefits to your state and to the nation as a whole. Now, the opportunities in North Carolina are indeed what we're seeing all across the country today. The safe implementation of our latest technology is moving our energy development into a new era, and in the process employing hundreds of thousands of Americans. And to put all the recent developments in perspective and to prioritize the steps that we encourage policymakers to make to improve that, the start of this year we issued a report that we call the State of American Energy. Our report highlights the facts that we are the most energy-rich nation in the world. Let me state that. We, the United States, are the most energy-rich nation in the world. When you consider U.S. fossil fuels, nuclear energy, as Jeff and others here are associated with, or even others who are focused on it, renewables, alternative energy sources such as biofuels, you see a country that has the largest resources around the globe. We have more than Saudi Arabia. We have more than China. We have more than Iraq, Iran, Kuwait combined. That's how rich our energy resource is here in this country. The oil and natural gas industry is proud to be part of this good news and the potential it offers our country. Many might not realize, but we have 3 western states, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, that have more oil than Saudi Arabia. 3 western states have more oil than Saudi Arabia. Our challenge to date is that lies on federal lands, and our federal policymakers have not had the political will or courage to step out and say we can develop that resource in a safe and sound way. New discoveries, enhanced production technologies, and efficiency improvements mean we have more oil and natural gas resources than anyone ever thought possible just 20 years ago. And that's good news for our nation as a whole. That's also good news for those of you here in North Carolina and your economic development. We have new finds in the Deep and Dan River basins underneath 12 counties in the Tar Heel State, coupled with the industry's technological improvements, are bringing great possibility for energy development. The growth of oil and natural gas development across the country has also created the ripple effect for other industries, as I mentioned earlier, the manufacturing base, our chemical base. Many of those companies are returning home, insourcing those jobs because of affordable, reliable energy. Today, the oil and natural gas industry supports 9.2 million American jobs. We're responsible for 7.7% of our gross domestic product. We contribute, this is going to surprise you, $86 million a day to the federal government. $86 million a day to the federal government. We pay an effective tax rate of 41%. The other standard industrial companies pay on average 26%. So when we hear the President of the United States stand up and say we're heavily subsidized and we're not paying our fair share, there's nothing further from the truth. We not only pay our fair share, we pay more than our fair share, but we're proud to pay it. We're happy to do so. We just wish people would realize, or some policy members would recognize, that by allowing us to produce our own energy, that $86 million a day can go up considerably. It's estimated by 2030, if given the opportunity to develop our own domestic resources without any change in tax policy, we would generate an additional $800 billion to the federal treasury. Now, when you think about the issues that confront us today, need for jobs, need for revenue, need for energy security, this is a triple win. But we've got to get the public policy right in order to realize this great potential. There are a number of things we would encourage policymakers to consider or to perhaps change to get the policies right. First, to increase access in areas currently off limits, restoring efficient and timely leasing and permitting programs. Second, to pursue common sense rules that support the development of our domestic resources without unnecessarily burdening them. Many of you may have heard of the Shale exploration opportunities in the Arctic, the Chukchi Sea and off Alaska. That permit has been in operation or has been languishing now for 5 years. Shell has invested over $4 billion for the right to develop that resource, and it's unclear if they'll be given the opportunity to drill the first exploratory well even this summer. 5 years, $4 billion investment, and they still don't have certainty if they can develop that because of burdensome regulatory policies where you never get an answer, uncertainty. That is not akin to assisting the development of these vast resources, as many of you in other industries know. And finally, we strongly encourage this administration to look at the infrastructure issues. The Keystone XL pipeline should be approved immediately. 20,000 new American jobs attached to that. 2 environmental reviews over the course of 3 years when the President, in our view, made an arbitrary decision to cancel the pipeline for, in our view, pure political considerations. Interestingly, if we expand or utilize our Canadian oil sands, build the Keystone pipeline, develop our domestic biofuels, the United States and Canada combined could make us energy self-sufficient in 12 short years, meaning on those 2 continents we could produce all the liquid fuels we need to power our economy in just a little over a decade. While we have the abundant resources and the ability to access those resources safely and responsibly and with care for the environment, as I mentioned earlier, we simply lack the political will. We often hear one thing and see another. We hear the need for more energy to put downward pressure on prices, while at the same time we see the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. We see the languishing permit for Shell oil in the Arctic I just mentioned to you. And we see the inability on the part of regulators and governmental officials to open up these vast areas. Today, as a result of presidential edict, 85% of our outer continental shelf has now been placed off limits once again. Last week, the Secretary of Interior went to Alaska and announced what I think he thought was going to be a great announcement, where he indicated he was going to allow about half of our National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska to be developed for oil and gas purposes. 30 or 40 years ago, that area was specifically set aside for oil and natural gas development. The announcement last week was an arbitrary decision to say, well, that might be the will of the Congress, but we're only going to allow about half of it to be developed. It's amazing what you hear and what we see happening. We believe the actions have to match the words, and today they don't, unfortunately. These sorts of policies would take us a long way to securing our energy future. We hear out of one side of our mouth the need to develop America's natural gas resources. Today, under the current administration, there are 10 federal agencies looking to regulate hydraulic fracturing. 10 different agencies looking to slow down the very technology that has allowed us to become more energy self-sufficient as a nation. If we are not allowed to move forward with hydraulic fracturing, which, as I mentioned earlier, is proven technology that's been around over 65 years, it will put at risk 69% of our natural gas resource here in the United States. You cannot be for natural gas development and against hydraulic fracturing. So as we look at the various issues before us today, there's much to do. I believe it's compelling that we as a nation, if we get our policies right, can put us on a new road to prosperity, can create jobs, can bring economic recovery to this nation merely through our energy resources. Now let me close with a couple thoughts about what we're doing as an industry to try to educate, to reach out, and to engage in this discourse. Not only coming to great forums like yours here today, and I sincerely appreciate your attendance, knowing you're in the middle of the summer season, you have many other more important things to do. But in addition to these sorts of dialogues, at the first of the year we launched what we call Vote for Energy. This is not a partisan campaign. It's not about political parties. It's merely designed to educate the American people, to educate voters, to put front and center this question of energy and what it means for us as a nation, what it could do for us in our economic recovery and our job creation. We've gone all across this country. We're particularly active in some of the target states. I believe you may have seen our ads here in North Carolina. But to talk about this new game-changing paradigm, and once again, if we get it right, it will literally reshape our nation for generations yet to come. We have never in our lifetime, though we span many generations here, had an opportunity like we have today in the area of energy. If we get it right, it will reshape our dynamic and the geopolitical dynamic for generations to come and will put us on a course of self-sufficiency as a nation. We welcome your involvement. We promote transparency in the conversation and hope we will anchor this discussion in a fact-based dialogue that will allow us to move our nation forward. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you'd have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you on behalf of the World Affairs Council, Charlotte. I want to thank you for coming today and educating us a little bit more on the American Petroleum Institute and all the things that you all do.
Thank you.
For the question and answer period here, we have a microphone right here located about midway back in the room. If you have a question, please go to the microphone and we'll go ahead and queue you up and take questions at this time.
Thank you. I'm in favor of all the stuff you mentioned if it's safe. Now, these things we saw in the newspaper about Pennsylvania, that something got in the water supply, are those false reports in the newspaper? Also, since this might be my only chance at the mic, about the pipeline going down through the aquifer in several Midwestern states, that's of concern to me that might break. But why not build refineries in North Dakota for that whatever's coming out of Canada instead of taking it all the way down to Texas and then bringing it back around places in the United States? Is it impossible to build refineries anymore?
It's very difficult to build a refinery. Let me answer that first if I can. You might have to remind me of the other comments. Refineries in the United States, what we've seen is over the last decade or two, there have been very little, if any, new refineries built, but we've expanded our footprint. Today we have the capacity to refine enough product to satisfy our entire market. In fact, some would be surprised to know today we export some gasoline finished product because we have more than we can consume domestically. Now the marketplace is literally changing, and that change is moving quickly in places like North Dakota, for example. There is consideration and talk about new pipelines moving up from the mid-continent, if you will, over to the Northeast, where we've had to shut down a couple refineries which were not cost competitive, as opposed to taking it clear to the Gulf Coast refining and piping it back up to the New England area. So you'll see the marketplace continue to move as a result of this vast resource. Many don't realize this has really been a game changer in just the past decade. Just one quick example to illustrate that with North Dakota. Just about 10 years ago, the U.S. Geological Survey estimated North Dakota had 400 to 500 million barrels of oil under it. This is when we were improving on our technologies to produce it. A few years later, they estimated it probably had about 4 billion barrels of oil. Today, the experts who spent time up there estimate North Dakota may have as much as 24 billion barrels of oil just under North Dakota. That's all occurred in the past decade. So we're literally right at the heart or right in the middle of these game-changing opportunities. So you will see changes, refinery, infrastructure, pipelines, et cetera, that will occur as a result of these newfound opportunities.
So, okay, thank you for that. It's still not, you say there's a lot of unused refinery capacity now, so there's not a need really to make refineries, like build refineries in
Well,
North
it's
Dakota
not that so
for the
much that it's
Canadian
unused. We
oil.
have a lot of capacity in this country, and obviously we try to make it more as efficient as we can in producing finished product. So over time, the market will react to that need based on where the supply is. Historically, most of that has gone to the Gulf Coast where we could permit and build refineries, and that's where the vast majority of our infrastructure is today. But there are other individual refineries scattered all across the country.
Okay, thank you. Now, as far as the first question about Pennsylvania, were those false things that we saw in the newspaper that some of the fracturing had got chemicals and stuff in the water supply in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, and the source for that is the Environmental Protection Agency, specifically the administrator. She's now testified under oath in the Congress on 2 different occasions that there has never been a case of groundwater contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. So I just want to make that abundantly clear because I know a lot of what you hear oftentimes and you read in the media would suggest otherwise. There were 3 particular cases that they kept suggesting, and when I say they, by and large it's the critics of oil and natural gas development. There are groups in this country, as you know, who would prefer that we not produce nor consume fossil fuels. There was a case in Texas, there was a case in Wyoming, and cases in Pennsylvania. And since then, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the state regulators, have clarified those issues were not attendant to hydraulic fracturing. So yes, it was false if you read it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. And you're right, I grew up and worked in the oil patch in the early 60s and participated in fracking many, hundreds or maybe thousands of wells, and I don't recall ever having a problem. My question is that according to the U.S. Commerce Department statistics last year, 2011, the U.S. refineries exported over 500,000 barrels of gasoline and diesel a day, $80 billion. And number one, that's an enormous amount of gasoline, and so therefore if we drill more, is it going to help lower our gasoline prices because we're exporting it? Thank you.
Great question. There's 2 answers to that question. The first one is we're exporting today, and it's a relatively small piece. I believe it's about 3% or less of what we produce in this country. So it's a relatively small number. The volume seems high, but we produce millions of gallons, of course, across to fuel our economy. But the second part of it is, and this is an area we need to make sure that people understand there's a disconnect. The value, the cost of gasoline is driven by the cost of crude oil. So it's like building a car. If you want to know what your car is going to cost, go figure out what the cost of the steel is. Once that car is built, that's what your cost structure is. Some people get confused and say, well, wait a minute, if we've got this excess gasoline that we can now export, surely the price is going to come down. But the way to affect the price, to put downward pressure on price, is to deal with the input cost, in this case crude oil. Over 80% of the cost of a gallon of gasoline is directly tied to the cost of crude oil. The number 2 factor that drives your cost of gasoline in the state of North Dakota is the 62-cent per gallon tax, federal and state. So if you look at those 2 factors combined, the cost of crude oil and your state tax, there's generally between 5 and 12 cents on each dollar that's left that the oil and natural gas industry looks for, finds, produces, transports, refines, and puts in your gas station, the local pump. That's really the equation of what the cost considerations are. So if we're worried about price, which we all are, we want affordable, reliable energy, we need to look to crude oil and how we impact that price. Now, part of what we're talking about here is a partial solution to that. If you look at the factors that drive the cost of crude oil around the world, unrest in the Middle East, market expectation, where's it going to be in the future? Are we going to get disruption with the Straits of Hormuz being closed, and the issues go on and on? The demand coming out of places like China, India, and part of the developing world. Value of the dollar, the list goes on. But the one area we do have control is supply. The one area we can make a contribution to that global set price is by bringing more supply to the marketplace. And unfortunately, we're the only industrialized nation in the world that hasn't taken advantage of that. That's why we believe if we're serious about producing affordable, reliable, low-cost energy, we need to get busy and produce our own energy, put that into the global market in the case of crude oil, and it will put downward pressure on those prices. That's the answer to the question, and that's why we hope through policy we'll be able to do that in this country.
Here and appreciate the information. I'm just curious, you mentioned several times about getting public policy right, given the divisive nature we have in politics today. In fact, we have a long history of this conversation in this country as long as I've been alive. What do you think the probability of getting it right and coming to any consensus on this issue is in the United States?
Well, I might be the world's optimist, but I think the chances are actually improving. And let me tell you why I say that. What we see now, and some of it goes back to our Vote for Energy campaign. In our survey we conducted just a week ago, 92% of the American people understand oil and natural gas development equals jobs. There's nothing more important to the American people today than job creation, economic recovery, as we see and as you often hear talked about in political circles. So I think we're doing the right thing, and as an industry we're spending resource to make this happen, and that's to educate the electorate. When you look at public policy officials and you look at the Congress of the United States, they're lagging indicators. They're not leading indicators. And I say that not to be unkind. I'm sure, Ruth, you're different in this. In the state of North Carolina, they're leading indicators. Elsewhere, they're lagging indicators. And what I mean by that is elected officials are driven and moved by what they hear from the voters. And if the voters aren't expressing their interest about, we need to focus on energy, and it's important we produce all forms of energy, renewables, oil, gas, nuclear, the list goes on. And I think the public is becoming more and more engaged in that dialogue. I might be too optimistic, but I am optimistic that dynamic is changing. And you can watch it today in both political parties or all political parties. Energy will be a top drawer discussion between now and November. You see it already. You see the president come out talking about increased oil production in the United States. Well, we do have increased oil production in the United States. What he didn't say was it's in spite of him and not because of him. And I say that not to be unkind, but to just be factual. Production of oil and natural gas in the United States is up today on private and state land. Federal land, it's down. The areas where the president has control, permits and leases in the Rocky Mountain states are down 44%. That's the future that fills that pipeline. Production out of the Gulf of Mexico today is down 22% over where it was projected to be. So it is factually correct for the president to say our production is up, but it's coming under the leadership of governors in places like North Carolina on state and private lands, not on the federal lands. So our simple point is, let's get the policy right. Let's look at those federal lands shared by all citizens. Let's develop that resource. We as an industry pay for the right to go look. A lot of people have the misconception that there's little pools of oil out there and the government knows where it is and they give us the right to go put a straw in it and extract it. Not true. The government doesn't have a clue where these resources are. We, when we buy a lease, we're given the opportunity to go out and look for that resource, our money, our risk, and we invest hundreds of millions, indeed billions of dollars to do that. We pay for that lease to do that. In addition to that, we pay an annual fee to hold that lease to continue to look. If we ever find anything and produce it, we pay a royalty, generally about 18% on everything we produce that goes back to the government. So there's very little risk to the federal government in this process, but they've got to have the political will to say, let's go look at Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, where we have more oil than Saudi Arabia, and let's begin to develop those resources in a way that protects the environment, protects our workforce, but just think of what it does for not only job creation, but revenue generation at a time we need it most. So I'm more optimistic than most. I really believe, hopefully over the next few years, we're going to get a sound energy policy in this country.
You make an excellent case about developing the resources we have and supply, and I would say the majority of your remarks were targeted at supply. What is the American Petroleum Institute's stance on demand, and what either businesses or individuals can do to reduce consumption of oil and fossil fuel? We're under 5% of the world's population, and we use over 25% of the world's oil and gas. I'd just be curious, does APEI even have a stance on demand?
Oh, absolutely. Let me dispel one of the myths surrounding demand and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency and using less energy makes good business. Now, all you people in the business community here understand what I'm saying. You instruct your people every day to look at how to cut costs. There's not a better way to cut costs than to use less energy and to consume less to produce more, essentially, to become more efficient. In the oil and natural gas industry, we're heavily focused on efficiency. We believe efficiency should be one of the centerpieces, if you will, of sound energy policy. But in doing that, we've also got to be realistic about what it takes to fuel this domestic economy of ours. Today, 62% of all the energy we consume is oil and natural gas. The experts will tell you, the current administration will tell you, by 2035, 55% of all the energy we'll consume in the United States will still be oil and natural gas. It took us 100 years in this country to get off wood as our primary form of energy. So as we evolve to new cutting-edge technologies, more efficient technologies, it will take time. But I'll tell you, the oil and gas industry are the leaders in investing in those technologies. Here's a fact that will surprise you. The federal government has spent $43 billion since 2000 to develop zero-emitting and low-carbon emitting technologies. The oil and natural gas industry since 2000 has spent $71 billion, almost twice what the federal government has spent, to find those breakthrough technologies where we don't emit any carbon or we emit very little carbon. Today, our carbon emissions in the United States are at 1992 levels. Why are they there? Because of natural gas. Natural gas has now moved into the marketplace because we've produced vast amounts of it on state and federal land. Just in the last few years, that price has dropped from $13 to $3. Now, what does that mean for consumers? Today, consumers on a daily basis save $500 million a day because of that natural gas price dropping. It dropped because we produced it right here on our own soil. When you look at your utilities, you look at Duke and others, and we had an opportunity to be with the president last night and visit, and I've had many conversations with Jim Rogers. They are looking at these issues going forward, and affordable, reliable natural gas is one of the best ways to deal with efficiencies, environmental protection, et cetera. So we're part of the solution to that. A lot of people have this mythical idea that somehow oil and gas isn't interested in those. Nothing's further from the truth. We're walking the walk. I can tell you our industry is so competitive. If one of our companies found the breakthrough technology and they could commercialize it, it'd be on the street tomorrow. And they're looking for those opportunities through solar, through wind, through biofuels. I was struck a few months ago and the president made another announcement about we're going to go out and take $17 million of taxpayers' money and we're going to invest in algae. Some of you remember that conversation? 2 years ago, Exxon invested $600 million to develop algae as a low-carbon emitting technology. So this industry is the leaders. We're energy companies, not just oil and gas companies. And we're looking to change that future. But it doesn't happen overnight. You can't flip the switch and go from today to tomorrow and literally change that energy makeup. These projects that we produce cost millions, indeed billions of dollars. They're very serious investments. When we think of timelines, you think of your quarterly reports in the corporate world, our guys look down the road 5, 10, 20 years before they make investments. Some of these single investments are $8 billion. So this is serious business. It takes $500,000 a day to operate a rig in the Gulf of Mexico. Think about the nature and the magnitude of that. That's the business we're in, so we're looking for those breakthrough technologies, and efficiency needs to be right front and center, a centerpiece. We can all do this better, and we should.
Jack, let me ask a question.
Please.
And
Let's
if
make it easy.
well, this is actually a pretty easy question. It's almost like a softball throw here. But if there was a Jack Gerard administration, and you were then asked, what 3 policy decisions would you put in place in the oil and gas industry to move it forward or to improve what the government should be doing? What policies would that be? What 3 policies would you put in place?
Great question. I'm not very optimistic there'll be a Jack Gerard administration. So the first one we'd do is we'd look closely at the potential to develop our own resource here in this country. And through federal policy, both onshore and offshore, we'd want to look through a planning process that very quickly opens up our ability to produce in the Outer Continental Shelf. For example, this will also surprise you. The data we have off the Carolina coast and off of Virginia in terms of what might potentially be there, it's 35 years old. The coastline in the South Atlantic has not been looked at for essentially 35 years with our new 3D and 4D seismic opportunities that are much more sophisticated, where we're much better able to identify the potential for resource. So that's one of the first things we need to do, is go out and say, okay, let's start looking, let's start identifying just how significant this resource is. The second thing I would do is I would put in order the regulatory regimes. As I mentioned earlier, today in the federal government there are 10 federal agencies looking to regulate hydraulic fracturing. Now I know many of you will think, well, that's appropriate. EPA, well, that is appropriate. Department of Energy, that's appropriate. But the Department of the Army, Securities and Exchange Commissions, Center for Disease Control, those are the different entities looking to regulate a high-tech technology to produce oil and natural gas. So we've got to get this regulatory activity under control, and coupled with that, get a permitting process where you can make good, sound environmental safety decisions in an efficient manner. To have a project with a $4 billion investment, as I mentioned earlier, Shale has in the Arctic, linger for 5 years is unacceptable. It's amazing we get anything done in this country with government that moves that slowly. Can you imagine in your own businesses? Now I know some of you in the nuclear business can probably show longer periods of time leading up to the permitting process. But we've got to reshape that and change the attitude where business is not the enemy. Government and regulation has a very appropriate role. And we need to develop robust systems, but we've also got to develop systems that make decisions, that say yes or no, and don't leave people in this guessing game of uncertainty for many years to come. Industries like ours that are large, we have the ability to go elsewhere, and we do. If we look at an opportunity to develop a project in Africa, in Russia, in Australia, where we can get a permit in a year versus wondering if at the end of 5 years we're going to get a permit in the United States, I can tell you where the board of directors is going to direct that investment. Now, the third thing we need to look at, and this impacts us all, is our fundamental infrastructure issues. And this goes back to issues like pipelines, our efficiencies, our ability to move product, if you will, from the Midwest to eastern refineries, or to build those refineries right there. We have not really focused on our infrastructure in this country like we should, and it goes all the way down to our highways and elsewhere. We need, as a nation, to restore our role as leaders in infrastructure. Pipelines are by far the safest way to move product. It's more safe than putting it on a barge. It's more safe than putting it on a train or putting it on a truck. Many of the critics of our industry use things like pipelines as surrogates to shut down the actual activity itself. But that's the safest way to move it, and we need to look at infrastructure. So we need to look at access, the regulatory regime, and infrastructure. If we get those 3 issues right or get close to them, you'll see our economy come back, and you'll have a heavy emphasis on energy that'll put our people back to work.
Jack, I want to thank you for
Thank you.
sharing your thoughts with us today.
I appreciate
and we
it.
appreciate you coming to Charlotte. And I understand Jack will be back for the Democratic National Convention And there are several events that the American Petroleum Institute will be involved in with that. So we'll look forward to seeing you back again.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Thank you, folks.